Anti-Semitism in Europe, Implications for Liberal Democracy and Lessons to be Learned. Hello and welcome to this latest session in our webinar series made possible by the Ruth K. and Shepard Broad Distinguished Lecture Series at the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs at Florida International University here in Miami. I'm David Kramer, Senior Fellow with the Green School and Director of the European and Eurasian Studies Program, and I want to welcome you to this seminar here today. Once again, we're very proud to partner with our wonderful friends at AJC, the American Jewish Committee, with a special shout out to Brian Siegel and Michael Winograd. This event is co-sponsored today by the Václav Havel Program for Human Rights and Diplomacy, Hillel FIU, Holocaust and Genocide Studies Program, the Jewish Museum of Florida at FIU, European and Eurasian Studies Program, and the Global Jewish Studies Program. We last met on the subject of anti-Semitism in July when we looked at the growing crisis here in the US. The problem, of course, has existed for a much longer period of time on the European continent. The goal is generally the same: marginalizing, converting, or eliminating Jews. The Holocaust, of course, marked the most gruesome and horrific toll in Europe a mere 8 decades ago when the Nazis and their enablers killed 6 million Jews. Nothing of that magnitude has occurred in Europe since, but anti-Semitism, sadly and disturbingly, is alive and well to this day. When we hosted the last webinar in July on anti-Semitism in the United States, I quoted from an op-ed in the Miami Herald by AJC's regional director, Brian Siegel, and it remains relevant for today's discussion. Anti-Semitism, Brian wrote, challenges universal interests and values. Left unchecked, it will undermine the essential principles of democratic society. That's why effectively combating anti-Semitism should be a priority for all. Today, we can do better than my quoting from Brian's article. Brian is with us to offer a few opening remarks. So Brian, let me turn it over to you. And thanks very much again for partnering with us and joining us here this morning.
Thank you so much, David. It's really an honor to partner with the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs of Florida International University, and with you in particular, for this important program. You know, as you said, in recent years, we've witnessed violent attacks on Jews and Jewish institutions in Europe, proposals in some countries to ban central Jewish religious practices, and anti-Jewish sentiments expressed by the leaders of far-right and left-wing political parties. Incidents of verbal and even physical harassment have become commonplace in some major European cities, and a sizable percentage of Jews refrain from wearing identifiable signs of their Jewishness in public. These fears, combined with the still very real concerns of synagogues and schools and other Jewish buildings may serve as targets of terrorist attacks, mean that the issue of security remains at the top of the agenda for European Jewish communities. AJC counters anti-Semitism in all its guises by calling on governments to act and by organizing coalitions with other faith and ethnic groups for a unified front against hate. AJC is the leading global Jewish advocacy organization with unparalleled access to government officials, diplomats, and other world leaders. Through the relationships that we've built and our international presence, AJC is able to impact policy and opinion on our priority issues of combating anti-Semitism and extremism, defending Israel's place in the world, and safeguarding the rights and freedoms of all people. It's essential that we in the United States learn the lessons from the experiences and challenges that Europe has faced in confronting anti-Semitism so that we can more effectively combat it there and here. So I am very grateful to my AJC colleagues from Europe for being with us today, and we're extremely appreciative to our friends at FIU's Green School for bringing us together for this important conversation. Thanks again, David.
Brian, thank you, and thanks to your great team for being such terrific partners over a long period of time with us at FIU and the Green School. This has been an incredibly important partnership to us, and we greatly appreciate it. As you mentioned, we're very fortunate to have two of your colleagues join us from Europe. I should say with regret that Simone Rodin-Benzaquin, AJC's Director General in Europe, turned out not to be able to join us today, but stepping in for her is Julie Decroix, the Associate Director of Paris-based AJC Europe since 2015. Julie has been the Associate Director of Paris-based since 2015. She first came to AJC in 2009 as Deputy Director of AJC Paris, before serving as Projects Manager to the French Special Envoy for the Middle East Peace Process at the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And also joining us, as originally scheduled, is Sebastian Rehat, who is Acting Executive Director for AJC in Central Europe. Sebastian joined AJC in 2017, and before that, he worked for 11 years with the Polish Foreign Ministry in the domain of Polish-Jewish relations. And between 2013 2016, he served as Special Envoy of Poland's Minister of Foreign Affairs for relations with the Jewish diaspora. So if I can, Julie, let me turn to you first to kick us off with some opening remarks, then we'll turn to Sebastian, and then we'll open it up. And let me just let all of our viewers know that the Q&A function is open for you to send in any questions or comments, and we welcome those very much. Julie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you for having me, first of all. And thank you to your team. Exactly 20 years ago, the second Intifada outbroke, and with it, a sudden rise of anti-Semitism in France, to the extent that commentators at that time were referring to the importation of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on French soil. Actually, when you look at the statistics, before the beginning of the years 2000, there were approximately 80 anti-Semitic acts a year in France, and after that it immediately jumped up to more than 300 anti-Semitic acts. Since then, France has more or less had between 300 and almost 1,000 anti-Semitic acts a year. And we even have an increase between 2018 and 2019 of 74%. So in France, as you can see, the problem didn't just start with the murder of Mireille Knoll. I'm sure you've heard about it, this Holocaust survivor 2 years ago, or even back then in 2015 with the attack of the Hypercacher. There are, as you can imagine, repercussions very concretely for the Jewish community, who has somewhat lived in a state of anxiety. AJC recently conducted a survey revealing that 34% of Jews in France actually do feel threatened. And among them, most particularly young Jews, there are 80% to report having experienced firsthand themselves an anti-Semitic act. This comes, of course, in a context of growing anti-Semitic acts in France, with more recently, before the lockdown that started in March, cemeteries desecrations, tags. We even had anti-Semitic slogans and chants during the demonstrations against racism following the death of George Floyd. And I can also mention anti-Semitic caricatures that were linking Jews to the virus during the corona crisis. So what is particularly striking, though, is that out of all recorded hate crime, 40 to 50% are of anti-Semitic nature. It means that Jews in France, although they only represent less than 1% of the total French population, and for that they are, I should say, the largest Jewish population of Europe, the second largest being in the UK, this only 1%, even less than 1% of the total French population, suffers from half of all racist acts. I mentioned France, obviously, where I'm sitting right now. But today, actually, no places are immune from anti-Semitism, which has definitely become a general European concern. And if you look at reports in the UK, for instance, they also show an increase of anti-Semitism over the past years. You can also take the attack of Halle in Germany of last year. That has been also a reminder that violence can really erupt at any times and also in any places, even in a country where after the Holocaust, you would never imagine that a single Jew could be endangered. The Fundamental Rights Agency of the European Union conducted a survey last year at the European level on Jewish perceptions, and it clearly showed a growing concern with almost 90% of Jews in Europe surveyed declaring that they noticed themselves a growing tendency of growing anti-Semitism in their own country over the 5 past years. 1 out of 5 reported to have been personally assaulted or harassed. And when it comes to the fear of being assaulted, France and Sweden ranked far higher than any other European countries. And so it's important to understand that this anti-Semitism has come from 3 distinct sources. First, from parts of the far left, who, in the context of their hatred of Israel, contribute to the dissemination of anti-Semitic tropes, particularly under the auspices of the BDS movement. The second source comes from the far right, with the proliferation of white nationalist conspiracy theories online, and also organized groups offline that are, by the way, gaining traction. And finally, a dramatic increase of anti-Semitism comes from Islamists. So all anti-Semitic attacks in the past 30 years in Europe have been committed by jihadists. So Islamists, whether violent or not, have had made anti-Semitism really their political backbone, disseminating deadly theories about Jews. And maybe we will discuss this later on, but it is actually absolutely key, I think, to confront all these forms of anti-Semitism without exception. Now, what has been important to consider really is the response to this concerning phenomenon and how we address the issue. It is actually immensely important to address it because if it starts with the Jews, it doesn't end there. Brian, you mentioned it. I mean, it not only affects Jewish communities, but it really has to be viewed as a problem for our societies as a whole. The United Nations Rapporteur on Religious Freedom issued a report on anti-Semitism last year, where he stated that anti-Semitism is toxic to democracy. And I think this is indeed very important to consider that any assault on Jews, and by the way, as for any other minorities, constitute an assault on our core democratic values. Because liberal values are supposed to protect minorities, as we often saw that hatred against Jews can often be seen as an alarming signal of a broader problem. I'm sure you've already heard this famous expression describing Jews as the canaries in the coal mine. So this is exactly this idea that anti-Semitism is often the expression of the start of a democratic crisis, which is more profound. So I'd like to conclude with a certain degree and certain sign of hope, saying to you that there is still a growing acknowledgement by the public at large in Europe that anti-Semitism is a problem for the society and not only for the Jews. That is showed in survey, also revealed by the fact that more and more media outlets have been interested in this issue. And I think this recognition is essential essential first for the Jews themselves, because Jewish community in Europe have for years felt totally abandoned by large parts of society. But important also because it can only lead public authority to be more and more committed to fight against the issue of anti-Semitism.
Julie, thanks so much. I appreciate that. Before I turn to Sebastian, let me just ask you if I heard you right here. You said in France, despite the fact that Jews make up less than 1% of the population, they have been the targets of half of all the attacks hate crimes that have taken place. Is that right?
Exactly. If you take all racist acts, basically half of all racist acts are anti-Semitic.
Wow, stunning number. Okay. Thank you very much, Julie. Appreciate that. Sebastian, let's get the perspective from you and there in Warsaw. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for the invitation. I'd like to start with quoting one figure from the same survey conducted by the European Union Fundamental Rights Agency that Julie has already mentioned, conducted in 2018. It also asked the question, I think one of the most important questions, about how people perceive their government's measures vis-a-vis anti-Semitism. So the question was, do you think your country government combats anti-Semitism effectively? The answer in Poland was 91% of those polled said, no, not at all, or rather not. The same question got similar answers in Hungary on the level of 83%. A vast majority of people feel that their governments are not doing enough to combat anti-Semitism. And I will, in this very short presentation, I'd like to focus on Poland and on one of the Baltic states, Lithuania. So if we could have the first slide, please. You will see an example of not only how people are receptive to anti-Semitic tropes, but how public media is using anti-Semitic elements, anti-Semitic iconography, to hoping that this will resonate with the society at large. The four pictures that you can see here, they come from one and the same news broadcast. It was aired in late June this year on Polish public television, just days before the first round of the presidential election. And basically like a 5-minute material, 5-minute broadcast focused on the opposition candidate claiming that he is being controlled by world Jewish milieus. And you have what you see in the pictures is the four principal elements that almost every anti-Semitic conspiracy theory includes, namely money, the Holocaust. You can see a picture of Auschwitz-Birkenau, Israel, and specifically in Europe, George Soros is the person who is very often referred to as the utmost Jewish philanthropist wishing to control Europe. So that the broadcast basically wanted to convey a simple message that if the opposition candidate wins, he will be controlled or under the influence of the so-called world Jewish lobby, and also he will be willing to give billions of dollars to Jewish restitution organizations. You will see on the next slide the name of the candidate was mentioned, and the what you see underlined with red means Jewish claims or Jewish demands. You can see a question mark, but actually the syntax is affirmative. Trzaskowski, the opposition candidate, will satisfy Jewish claims. And the question mark is actually not really important. It's basically sending the message that that person would be controlled by Jews and would give Polish taxpayers money to Jewish organizations. Now, on the other slide, you will see how we as AJC Central Europe reacted to that. We filed a complaint with the National Media Ethics Council. We included the full transcript of the broadcast, and it got coverage in international media, including not only in Poland, in Poland's most read newspaper, but also in world media, including the Jerusalem Post. This phenomenon is actually an illustration of what happens. It's not only that anti-Semitism may lead to weakening democracy, but weakening democracy, specifically liberal democracy, when it's in bad shape, it leads to popularity. It leads to all sorts of xenophobia gaining more and more popularity. This level of anti-Semitism, not only condoned by the authorities, but also made more popular by state-controlled media, that's something new. We have never had that before. The next slide is an illustration of how international bodies see the situation in Poland. So here you can see parts of a report put together by the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination that was published in August last year, even before this year's presidential campaign, and before that, the broadcast that you saw pictures. One of the conclusions is that public figures, including politicians and media officials, are frequently the source of such offensive statements or fail in their responsibility to strongly denounce hate speech. That's one thing. And the other thing was a recommendation to delegalize or disband certain far-right institutions. There's a small victory here. One of those institutions mentioned here, the Pride and Modernity Association, was disbanded this year in the spring. So what we have learned as AJC is react whenever and whatever means you have, react, call out, make people aware that what they are seeing is violates the rules of the democratic state of rule of law. And sometimes the outcome is immediate. Sometimes you have to wait, but it does help to be active and not to remain silent. I would stop here with Poland. Another example is Lithuania, which doesn't have problems with liberal democracy. It doesn't have problems with the rule of law, but it does have a problem with historical revisionism. What you can see on the next slide is an example of what is going on, what has been going on in Lithuania over the last couple of years. Lithuania, as a number of other Eastern and Central European countries, has a problem facing its wartime history. There was a number of Lithuanians and a number of Lithuanian organizations during World War II who collaborated with the German Nazis, including in the mass murder of Jews. And unfortunately, some of the national heroes in today's Lithuania, and they are national heroes because they also happened to fought the communist regime in 44 and 45 and after the war, they simply were part of those pro-Nazi groups who in 1941 actively participated in murdering Jews. On your right-hand side, the picture of a Spanish activist who actually criticized Lithuania and its government for trying to not to face up to historical truth, and he's actually being deported from Lithuania because he criticized the authorities and the Lithuanian society, taking pride in individuals who also participated in the Holocaust. On your left-hand side, one of, unfortunately, many examples over the last couple of years, anti-Semitic incidents, graffiti, or here making the form of a swastika in front of the headquarters of the Lithuanian Jewish community. So historical revisionism, it's not only Lithuania, it's to an extent also Latvia and Estonia, but specifically Lithuania recently has been going through a painful process of some people trying to face up to the not so pleasant reality, and some others opposing that. The next slide will show you how we work in or with Lithuania, and it's on your left-hand side. You see part of our private correspondence with the Lithuanian Foreign Minister. Early last year, we earned about a planned visit of the notorious Holocaust denier and World War II historian David Irving. He was planning a trip to Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. And we thought, well, it's actually impossible. If he's going to go and visit Auschwitz and Treblinka with a group of people, he'll be telling them that there was no Holocaust, and he will be showing them gas chambers saying it was for disinfection exclusively. So we sent a letter to the Lithuanian foreign minister asking, listen, this person is really a Holocaust revisionist. In response, Lithuania introduced a 5-year ban on David Irving. That decision was then followed by the Polish government as well. So that's how we also work. On your right-hand side, you see a tweet that we sent a few weeks ago in reaction to a decision to name to a prominent position in the Genocide Study Center in Lithuania, somebody who also sounded revisionist, who publicly spoke in ways that are unacceptable for a historian. So we also reached out to Lithuanian press and suggested that that the Lithuanian public knows what is going on, and that it's unacceptable for a country such as Lithuania going through this difficult process to name a person who at least distorts history, if not even promotes historical revisionism. What we can learn for the future is, I would repeat the same as was the case with Poland. We cannot remain silent. Whoever you can reach out to, whatever you can do to react and make people realize that something bad is happening, be that the media or international organizations, it's our role to remain vocal. And I'll stop here, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Great, Sebastian, thanks so much. Appreciate that very much. And let me actually start the conversation with you, if we can. To what extent did anti-Semitism pick up in Poland connected with the election? And have you seen any decline since the election ended in the summer?
Yeah, so basically our first reaction to what we saw on public television was we wrote it in a tweet. Do you really think that playing the Jewish card in Poland will resonate with the Polish public? Well, if yes, then that sends a clear message to the international public, because that would imply that you assume that the Poland will buy that. If you think that talking about and making popular anti-Semitic tropes, conspiracy theories is something people will not only listen to, but follow, then you're really painting a rather grim portrait of the Polish society. Whether the level of anti-Semitism has decreased over the last election, I think it's still too short a period to compare. But I can give you figures. The Polish government is, as any other government, is obliged to provide figures when it comes to acts not only of physical violence but all sorts of hate crime, both physical and oral hate speech, let's say. The numbers in Poland vary between 128 and 170 something over the last 5 years. The lowest number registered so far was last year, 128 acts of hate crime, anti-Semitic hate crime. 5 of them were acts of physical violence. So here, and it's something that the Polish government likes to underscore in comparison with Western Europe, there's really very few cases of physical violence against Jews. And that's true, but you also have to be aware, as Julie rightly pointed out, that it starts with the Jews, it never ends with the Jews, or it starts with somebody else, and they will get to the Jews as well. In 2014, 2015, during the so-called migration crisis, people of color were the primary target here, and they could get beaten up if they spoke a language they spoke Polish with an accent. You had kebab owners who got beaten up in Poland back then. So the numbers are not super high, but you never know when hate speech gets translated into acts of violence. And it's actually would be irresponsible to wait and see. It's actually, we should not wait and see, but act now.
Great, thank you. Julie, let me come back to you and ask, and perhaps it's a little early to tell since the pandemic has only been with us for 8 months or so. In Europe, started a little before it did here in the United States. But do you see the pandemic increasing scapegoating, finger pointing that includes a rise in anti-Semitism?
In fact, what we have noticed during the pandemic, and it is still continuing today, even if people are not locked down anymore, is an increase of conspiracy theories in general, but especially directed against Jews. So, of course, this is something we were expecting. It's not surprising because people were mainly online, they were at home, getting their information primarily from social media. And conspiracy theory were, before the coronavirus crisis, already at play. Several surveys, for instance, in France, we had a survey saying that almost 20% of young French believed in at least 1 out of 5 conspiracy theories. And now we see that the same number applies for when it comes to the question, do you think that the virus has been created in a lab? So we see that there is a vast number of people that actually do believe in this kind of theories. By the way, we see that among them, 40% of them, the believers in that the fact that the virus has been created in the lab, are voters of the extreme right. So it's also interesting, to see that this kind of people are also attracted to these conspiracy theories. And what we have noticed is a lot of anti-Semitic caricature, linking the virus to this belief that Jews might have created the virus and then have, in order to gain financially from selling a vaccine, or we have seen a lot on Soros, as Sebastian mentioned, on the Mossad. In France, we had even caricature representing our former Minister of Health, who was said to be a Jew, you know, poisoning the well. So we are here really with this kind of ancient imagery of Jews poisoning the well, as it was the case, you know, during the plague. So we have all these kind of conspiracy theories against Jews. And the question really is what can we do about it? So we alerted the governments, social media company, because it's very important that all these theories might be countered, and to work also with social media platforms in order for them to be better at fact-checking, moderation, in order to remove as much as hateful content as possible.
Thanks very much, Julie. Sebastian, back to you. Looking at countries in the region, you talked about Lithuania. Another country, a border, a neighbor of Poland is Ukraine, where it seems to have, it has many challenges and problems, but anti-Semitism does not appear to be one of them. I'm wondering if you've looked at the situation in Ukraine, and what is it that the problem of anti-Semitism, of course, it had a history in Ukraine, but in current day Ukraine doesn't seem to be emerging. Are there any lessons to be learned from Ukraine's experience right now that other countries could derive from?
I just want to make sure you said that anti-Semitism seems not to be a major problem in Ukraine. Yes?
My impression, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that Ukraine has been rated as one of the least anti-Semitic countries in the region for the past few years. Again, its history does not speak well of the problem, but more recently, it's been less of a...
Yeah, so I hope I will not take more than 1 minute to explain it. It's definitely anti-Semitism is still an issue in Ukraine, but it's not a problem that would dominate in Ukrainian society. Back in 2014, during the Orange Revolution, there was a lot of Moscow-inspired propaganda trying to portray Ukraine as an anti-Semitic country. And I remember at that time, there was a letter signed by one of the leaders of the Ukrainian Jewish community. It was an open letter to President Putin. It was published in the New York Times. And the letter simply said, yeah, well, we're not saying our country is free of anti-Semitism, but what you are doing is demonizing our country. That being said, there are political forces in Ukraine which are not really small fringe groups. They have become part of, I don't want to say mainstream political movements, but they are quite well accepted by society. They're called Svoboda, and the right-wing sector. Part of their agenda is really very close to neo-Nazi groups, and you have to be aware of that. They have aligned themselves with like-minded organizations in other parts of Europe, including the so-called, if I remember correctly, the Nordic League in Scandinavia. So it's definitely that part of the political spectrum in Ukraine that we have to pay close attention to. But it would be wrong to say that Ukraine is under the influence of anti-Semitic actors.
Great, thanks very much for that, Sebastian. And we are getting some questions. And again, for our viewers, please use the Q&A function to send in your questions. The first one, maybe Julie, I can go to you with this. Can you please comment on the increase in racial tensions in the US and whether this parallels what you identify in this discussion about Europe? So looking at what's happening in each continent and whether there are spillover effects.
actually both situations in terms of tensions in between communities may have differences, but what we can notice is that we have over the most recent years seen an anti-Semitic, I would say, transatlantic convergence of anti-Semitism. So it is a phenomenon that, as I said in my presentation, we've been noticing in Western Europe for quite a while, actually, over the past 20 years. And we have, as AJC, alerted right from the start about it. And the fact that, as I said, it goes together with a threatening of our democratic values. And so basically, the parallel that we can draw is that hate has also been in Europe motivated by hate speech, for instance, that we discussed about the coronavirus and how people were online attracted by conspiracy theories, but hate speech is also something that must be countered in general, because we know that words and writings are not only in the virtual world, they can totally lead into hate action. And for instance, when the events in Charlottesville and then in San Diego happened, there was also an aspect of online indoctrination in that, since the San Diego perpetrators said that Jews have had been there to replace Christians or something like that. So there are similarities. What we do have here in Europe is maybe more experience, if I can say so, about how to fight anti-Semitism. So that's maybe something that in our dialogue with our friends overseas, we can definitely explore.
Great, thank you. Let me ask the next question from FIU's own Pedro Bota, who asks, and maybe you can answer in your respective regions that you have responsibility for. Is there a country in Europe that stands out as an example of successful combating of anti-Semitism? He asks, is the Netherlands or Denmark? And then Sebastian, if you'd also look in your region as well. Maybe Sebastian, why don't we start with you, and then Julie will come to you.
Thank you. Thank you, David. I don't think there's one country that you could say is the best example, but still, out of the 7 countries that our office covers, and we cover not only Poland, Hungary, but also the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and the 3 Baltic states, the Czech Republic definitely is the best boy in the class. Not only in that the numbers of anti-Semitic acts or incidents are much lower than in most of the continent, even though there was an uptick, a small uptick when you compare 2019 to 2018, but it's not only the number of anti-Semitic incidents, again, I want to stress relatively low, but also the reactions. How do people react, including, if not specifically, the leaders? So just a small example from the Czech Republic. Recently, there was an incident, somebody claiming using anti-Semitism in the guise of anti-Zionism. Israel was heavily criticized, demonized, and then the Archbishop of Prague said, and I quote, "We do not want to remain silent if the Jewish state is approached with prejudice, with false accusations, and if the very right to its existence is questioned." That's a Catholic cardinal in the Czech Republic. That's simply an example to follow.
Great, Julie. How about in your region?
Yeah, actually, I would like to take the opportunity of that question to point out a paradox that we have in Western Europe, being that we have countries that, for instance, in the French case or the German case, that are where governments actually do their best to combat anti-Semitism. I mean, if you take France, Germany, also in the UK, you have a national coordinator to combat anti-Semitism who is an appointee at the governmental level. You have comprehensive curricula including Holocaust education. You have these countries that have adopted the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism. They also have put in place plans and strategies to combat anti-Semitism. So it also really takes, for this country, a lot of efforts to continue in the direction to implement a real zero tolerance policy to fight against anti-Semitism. For the definition about, so if I may say a few words about that, the definition of anti-Semitism, from the IRA, so the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which is a non-binding tool that helps defining anti-Semitism, has been adopted by more than 20 EU countries so far, including France, including Germany, including a whole range of countries that we mentioned, and really can be used at several levels, in the police sector for prosecution, in the education sector, in the judicial one, in order really to identify, because as Sebastian very rightly mentioned, we have to speak, but we have to know what we are talking about. We have to name names. We have to identify correctly anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism often is in disguise. It takes different forms. So it's crucial to understand what anti-Semitism is in order to combat it very efficiently. So this definition, for instance, has to also be concretely and efficiently implemented.
So Julie, your discussion of the definition leads to the question from Manny Flecker, and then I'll come to Oren Steer's question. And Manny Flecker asks, does either speaker have some idea for the origins of anti-Semitism? It is clearly not a new problem. In fact, it is probably a very ancient problem. But if either of you wants to jump in on that.
The general origins of anti-Semitism?
That's the question, it seems. It doesn't specify,
Yeah,
but yeah.
of course, it dates back to
answer it however you want.
Times to ancient Rome, which is why initially Christians were also persecuted against, because they were being perceived as just a Jewish sect. But of course a different story in contemporary world. The origins of anti-Semitism today. You basically have several layers of that. One is the traditional religious layer, and that's the case in Poland still. The other origin, the other source is the very existence of Israel. Yes, the very existence. To some people, that's something that they still cannot come to terms with. And specifically the fact that Israel is doing really great as a country, that it's high tech, its IT industry is one of the best in the world. And the other thing is, people like simple answers. No matter how complicated a question, no matter how complicated a problem they are seeking answers or solutions to, people, that's in our psyche. We like simple answers, and finding a scapegoat is actually that's the culprit. That's the group who bears responsibility for all your misfortunes. So I guess this is also what makes combating anti-Semitism quite a a complicated task and time consuming, and we have to put a lot of effort into this because it simply runs counter our psyche.
So let me maybe bring us toward an end here of this webinar with Oren Steer's question. And Oren, of course, is FIU's Director of Holocaust and Genocide Studies and one of our co-sponsors of today's webinar. And Oren says, thanks for mentioning social media. Given the constant proliferation of posts, the decline of traditional news organizations, and the authority of facts, and people's increasing preference for their own views, what hope is there that anti-Semitism might be reined in? So let me ask both of you to address that question. It gives an opening also, both of you have touched on this, the importance of raising awareness, pushing back, but maybe Julie will start with you, Sebastian will turn to you, and then we'll bring our session to a close.
Yeah, actually, I don't think I will be the optimistic in the room here. Unfortunately, we have seen this development with social media and the rise of conspiracy theories and online hate speech, and it's a higher risk that anti-Semitism will continue to show its ugly face. But the issue is also what can we do about it? So it's important to alert about it, to have a dialogue with social media company, to alert them also to be more mindful of what is actually on the internet and where the contents come from. So this has been also an effort led by several governments, but also at the European Union level. And this effort definitely has to be continued. And I would say that more generally, we have to encourage, I'm not speaking specifically for online, but also offline. We have to encourage moderate voices to deal with the issues. We were talking earlier on about the threats on democracy. We must absolutely encourage these moderate voices to deal with the issues that threaten democracies, because otherwise they will leave a void that will inevitably be filled by the extremists, the one who are fear-mongering, the one who push their own agenda, which is not a democratic one. So this, I would say, these moderate voices, once again, be they from the political sector or from civil society, really must speak out and denounce hate, extremism, bigotry, and really make an effort to come together in order to defend our core democratic values and the values we cherish the most.
Great. Julie, thank you. Sebastian, let me go to you for final thoughts.
It's a similar thing to the invention of dynamite. You can use it for practical purposes that help people, but dynamite and social media can be destructive. And what we're seeing on social media more often now than before is social media being sometimes hijacked by people who are spreading xenophobic, including anti-Semitic tropes, but we cannot stand idly by, and we're not doing that. The answer is AI and machine learning, and AJC Central Europe and AJC Paris as well. Julie, you may remember your colleague Shani Ben Walid cooperated with us last year in organizing what was called a hackathon, a 48-hour event that brought together IT people, social media people, coders, and the goal was, let's try and see whether we can create applications, online applications that would make life for anti-Semites harder. And it's possible. There are student groups, there are IT companies in Europe, in the US, in Israel. We're working with them. It's a new thing. they're trying to use the latest technologies, including the huge computing powers of IBM and Microsoft. We here in Warsaw are cooperating with a small startup company whose main objective is to try and develop applications that would prevent, I know specifically in the States, people will ask, what about the First Amendment? Well, we have to deal with that somehow. They want to develop online digital tools that would prevent the spread of hate. How do you know whether that's hate? Maybe that's a simplistic comparison, but you know, when you see pornography, you know it's pornography. So hate speech and incitement to hate, specifically to physical violence, you know when you see that in front of your eyes. So my hope is that we'll be using artificial intelligence and machine learning to counter the spread of anti-Semitism and other forms of xenophobia online.
Great, Sebastian, thanks so much. My apologies to Jennifer and Bonnie and Danielle, who unfortunately we've run out of time and aren't able to get to your questions. I will just say, Jennifer, your question about growing anti-Semitism in the US and political discourse, we did do a webinar in July that I recommend to take a look at. It's still very timely and relevant to your question. But Sebastian Rejak and Julie Dequoy, let me thank you both very, very much for terrific insights and really appreciate you sharing your perspectives. To my friend Brian Siegel and AJC, thank you very much as always for being such wonderful partners in raising such important issues for all of us here within the FIU community and beyond. And I want to thank the Ruth K. and Shepard Broad lecture series, distinguished lecture series at the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs. Here from Florida International University in Miami, I'm David Kramer. I want to thank you all for joining us here today and look forward to welcoming you